Paul Rosenfeld is a retired educator who worked in the New York City system as science and history teacher, science department chairperson at Totten Intermediate School in Staten Island, as well as the union chapter leader for several years. In addition to his education duties, he was the owner of a security alarm installation company that did work in New York and in New Jersey. Paul and his wife, Lenny, retired in June of 2003 and moved to Valencia Shores. They are snowbirds and spend the summer months in an adult community in Manalapan, New Jersey. The story that Paul will share with you today is unique because most Holocaust survivors left Europe immediately after the war. Paul's father and mother went back to Hungary and restarted their lives there. Paul came to the United States when he was 10 years old and has vivid recollections of the life in Communist Hungary and the anti-Semitism that finally forced his family to leave. Paul? The mic is on. You have water.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Susan, and thanks to Hadassah for having me back. Ladies and gentlemen, you may have seen me present a lecture very similar to the one you're going to see tonight here 6 years ago. It was the first time that I actually did it, and subsequent to that, I have presented it in many different venues. Hadassah's in New Jersey and Edison. I just did it to the Edison JCC 2 weeks ago. I've been asked to do it as a continuing education lecturer for the United Federation of Teachers. During COVID, we were doing it on Zoom. So I've been pretty busy with this. It all started out here. The last time I presented, I had not been back to Hungary since 1988. At that time, Hungary was still a communist country. And I really had qualms about going back there because I just had horrible memories of that place. But with the advent of the internet, I began to reconnect with some of my townspeople in Hungary, and I found out that my closest friend, whose name was Gabor, was not doing very well, and Letty and I decided to go back and pay a visit. And since that talk here 6 years ago, I've been back 3 times. My story, as was pointed out, is going to be different because a number of you in this room tonight were born to parents who survived the Holocaust, and your parents went to DP camps in Germany, or in Italy, and Austria, and elsewhere. My parents chose a different route. They went back to Hungary. Unfortunately, they went back to Hungary. In any case, let's begin. Gentlemen, could I have the first slide? Oh, here we go. I didn't realize it was behind me. Okay. In 1939, Hungary had about 500,000 Jews. 25% of them lived in Budapest. They were 4 to 5% of the population. Jews have been in Hungary since the 9th century. It's about 1,300 years. They have a long history there. Okay. Before World War II, the population of my hometown, which is called Szombathely, was about 1,000. Of those 1,000 people, there were 25 Jewish families for a total of 113 Jews. If you look at a map of Hungary that I have on the screen, you can see a little red star. Okay, my hometown, called Szombathely, is located approximately in that area, very close to the Romanian border. Now, when I lived there as a child, I knew we were close to Romania, but I never realized how close we were till we went back, when one day I was driving from my hometown to my mother's hometown, Cengher, and we passed the warning signs for the Romanian border. So I could literally have gone to the border by bicycle. Okay. After World War II, there were 3 Jews who returned to the town. Of the 113, 3 made it back. My father, Deje Rosenfeld, Gross Abraham and his nephew Gross Miklos. Now, a number of the survivors migrated to the United States, Canada, Australia, and other countries. Now, tell me if this is not a coincidence and a small world. Sitting right up front here in front of you tonight are two young ladies, one of them who's a resident of Valencia Shores, Marlene Lippener, and her sister Sandy. Could you stand up for a second? Marlene's father was a neighbor of ours in HaShoah, Hungary. My father and her father were best of friends, and once we came to the United States, they reconnected and they stayed friends throughout their life. I've known Marlene since we were both children going to the beach at Brighton Beach, and Sandy as well. Thank you. Just to go back to the bottom of this slide, many of you have heard of Hungary, and some of you may have even taken river cruises to Budapest. It's a beautiful city. To put things in perspective, Hungary is about 90% of the size of the state of Kentucky. You could drive from one side of Hungary to the other side probably in about 6 hours. I drove most of Hungary in about 3.5 hours. I was back there right before COVID, and I was near Lake Balaton. Oops, wrong button. Which is, sorry about that. I'll get it eventually. Here we go. I was in this region, and I drove to where the star is located in about 3.5 hours. So it's a small country. And there are 110 countries on this planet that are larger than Hungary. Now, Hungary wasn't always this side. Unfortunately, they have a history of picking the wrong sides to be in on wars. So after World War I and World War II, they lost almost 2/3 of their landmass. They're much smaller than it's much smaller than it used to be. In fact, if you go to the neighboring regions of Hungary, whether it's Slovakia or Ukraine or Romania, you're going to find towns that are basically Hungarian in nature. The language spoken there is Hungarian. My family has a long history in Hungary, with family members proudly serving in the army during World War I. This is a slide of my grandfather, Moses Hershkowitz, and he was a prisoner of war in France during World War I. This is a group photo of the Rosenfeld family in HaShoah. Judging by the age of my father in this photo, it was probably taken in the 1920s. And that dapper gentleman back there with hair, okay, because I never knew him with hair, was my dad. My Uncle Paul was a self-taught musician. He made his own violin, which he then taught himself to play. He was also an avid fisherman in the Somersha River, which was literally in our backyard. Now, I too have musical abilities and love fishing, so I assume that some of his DNA has found its place in me. This is my aunt, Serena. My father's oldest sister, Serena, migrated to the United States and married in the Bronx before World War II. The next slide shows the Hershkowitz women of Chenger. From left to right is my aunt, Yoli, my grandmother, and my mom, Charolta. This picture was taken sometime around 1938. Okay, from left to right in this picture is my mom, my great-grandmother, and grandmother, 3 generations. The only person in this photo who survived was my mom. My mom, as you can see from this photo, was rather attractive. She was a beautiful woman. Chengher is the home of the Hershkowitz family. It was 6 miles from Somershai, my father's town. My mom would take me there on a bicycle, riding on top of the levee to the Somersh River. Chengher had a large Jewish population, and by 1820, they built a large synagogue. In 1903, the community contributed 10,000 gold coins and built the addition to the synagogue, which housed the elementary school. The Jewish population of Chengher in 1912 was 800. In 1956, the synagogue was torn down. The addition, which was the school, still stands today, as you'll see later on. My grandparents in Chengher were grocers and had a successful business. On my last trip back 4 years ago, I found out that the store also served as a bar and liquor store. My mom never told me that. Okay, and it was known to the townspeople as Moses's Bar. Okay, interesting story about this photo. When I went back to Hungary for the 75th anniversary of the deportation of the Jews, I met with the curator of the museum, and all I wanted to find out was where this building was located, because I had a car and I wanted to see it. He looked at the picture and he flipped out. You know, he was putting together an exhibit of all the old buildings in Chengher, what Chengher looked like, and you know, he begged me to basically make him a copy of it, so I emailed it to him. It's now included in the exhibit there. The Jewish cemetery in Chengher has monuments dating back to the 1700s. The community was well established. This photo is of my father's first marriage. They had 3 young daughters. His wife and children were killed in Auschwitz. He rarely spoke about his family, but their loss scarred him deeply. Throughout his life, he was an angry man. That strange word at the bottom of the screen is Munkasogalat. Hungary entered World War II on the side of Germany. Jewish men were not allowed to serve in the regular army. Instead, they were forced into what was called Munkasogalat, which roughly translates as labor service. It was essentially forced labor, forced slave labor. Most men did not survive and did not return, therefore. This photo was taken in 1940. One of the men in the photo is my uncle Shandor. He mailed this postcard to his wife in Somershai. The men are smiling and playing with the bayonets and rifles. The photo was taken before Hungary became involved in the war. If you notice, you see a gentleman circled in red. That turns out to be my uncle. I never knew that. I always wondered who he was. On one of my trips back in the last 6 years, I visited a neighbor who was about 6 years older than I am, and who had a sister who was 8 years older than she was. She says, I don't know who's in the picture, but my sister might know. And she was able to identify my uncle, and he's marked off in the photo as a result. At this time, I'm going to take a pause for a second, because the story that I'm telling you tonight has basically been written already. It's called The Invisible Bridge by Judy Oringer. Any of you read the book? Okay, it was quite popular. The Invisible Bridge is an amazing book. It's about 700 pages in length, but once I picked it up, I couldn't put it down. I finished it in 3 days. You could change the name of the main character to Deja Rosenfeld, because this is my father's story, right up to the very end, where it details the family's escape to Austria in 1956. I was fortunate to meet the author at a book signing. I showed her some of my father's mementos. She was appreciative to having actually never seen some of them. For your information right now, if you have Netflix, there is a series on Netflix right now. It's called Transatlantic. Okay, Transatlantic details the story of people trying to escape the Nazis in Marseille, France. And it's based on a novel written by Judy Oringer, the same person who I'm talking about now. You may want to catch it. It's very good. Okay. The slave laborers were forced at gunpoint to build roads, dig ditches, work in mines, and clear minefields, frequently by walking through them and causing them to explode. Most of my father's forced labor took place in the cities of Minsk and Pinsk. At that time, it was part of Ukraine. Today, it's Belarus. Okay, the battalion, by the way, consisted of about, depending on which battalion it was, 500 to 800 men. Just to give you an idea of my father's battalion, 2 survivors came back. Fortunately for me, he was one of them. While attending Brooklyn College as an undergraduate in the late 1960s, I took many military history courses. I was a history major. There I had an amazing professor, Béla Királyi. In Hungary, he would be called Király Béla. He was a Hungarian general who actually was the leader of the military uprising against the Russians in 1956. Like the Rosenfelds, he escaped Hungary in the aftermath of the revolution. He had to flee to save his life. All of the politicians and military men who supported the uprising were taken to Russia, executed by hanging. After Hungary was free of the Russians in 1989, he returned to Hungary as a hero and became a member of their parliament. He died in Budapest in 2009 at the age of 98. His New York Times obituary revealed an amazing fact about this man. During World War II, he was the commander in charge of a group of Hungarian forced laborers. When the Germans moved in 1944, they demanded that he strip his men of their Hungarian army uniforms. They complained to him, "Why are you treating these men as equals?" Okay. The Germans wanted him treated as slave laborers. He refused their order, risked his life, and he protected his men. Most of the men under his command were well fed, okay, and they were taken care of and survived. He is recognized for his actions as a righteous Gentile at Yad Vashem in Israel. Never knew this about him. Interesting little story on the side. On one of our trips back with Lenny, we happened to be in the House of Terror, which is an amazing exhibit in Budapest. And we walk into a room, and there are a large group of people sitting in front of a large screen projection. And on the screen, there is a video of a post-Hungarian Revolution trial that was taking place. The man who was on trial in absentia was my history professor, Béla Királyi. What are the odds of that? Okay. On June 4th, 1944, all the occupants of the Máté Szalka ghetto, where my family was being held, were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mom was forced out of the cattle car. She saw a stretcher with a covered body on it. Only the shoes were exposed. My mother recognized the shoes immediately. Her mother, my grandmother, died in the cattle car, taking her to Auschwitz. The Hungarian Jews were then led to the selection line where Dr. Joseph Mengele was waiting. When my mother and her younger sister approached, my mother was about 22 at the time, and her sister was 15, by the way. Mengele sent my mother to the right. Her sister Yuli, who was only 15, was sent to the left, separating them. At this point, my mother became hysterical, yelling that she wanted her sister to be with her, and she did not want to be separated. Her effort was successful. Mengele pointed my aunt and told her to go to the right to my mother. Little did they know that my mother just saved her sister's life. Okay. While in Birkenau, my mother told of surviving on bread and soup and scraps of food, including stolen potato peels. She worked in a factory making cots for the German army. Many of the prisoners died of typhus in the crowded barracks where each held 36 wooden bunk beds. This is a photo that I took in 2018 when Lenny and I were in Poland. Fortunately, the Hungarians were the last European Jews to be deported to Auschwitz in May of 1944. Auschwitz was liberated on January 27, 1945, so a lot of them weren't even there for a year, which is quite a long time to be in a hell. My mom did not realize that she was in Birkenau until 50 years later. In 1994, she went back to Auschwitz with her sister and an Israeli delegation that was there to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the liberation. She regretted that she made the trip. She had many nightmares after this visit. 565 Hungarian Jews were killed between 1941 and 1945. Today, there are about 100,000 Jews that remain in Hungary. Of those, about 10,000 or so are observant of the religion. This is a photo of what the inside of those Birkenau bunks look like. Liberation. Oh, this is what's left of the barracks in Birkenau. If you go back to the other picture, you could just visualize all those people crammed in there. And the buildings were very long, uninsulated, and there was one small wood-burning stove at the head of the building. There's no possible way that that stove could have kept anybody warm. And I don't even want to get into the sanitary facilities, because those were beyond. After liberation, many surviving Hungarian Jews opted to move to Palestine or other countries of the world. Many lived in DP camps in Germany till they were able to immigrate to their new homes. A number of my cousins and friends were born in German DP camps while their families waited to leave for the United States. My parents opted to return to their homes to Hungary and see who was still alive. After returning, my parents found that most family members were killed. This, by the way, is something that I had just learned today. My cousin Moore, who lives in Israel, posted a Yom HaShoah message, and in there he references my late aunt and uncle. My mom never told me this, but when they returned to Chengher, they found that their home was occupied by town residents. And when they wanted to come back to their homes, they were basically told that if you don't get out of here within 24 hours, we will kill you. Okay. My uncle Pal, or actually pronounced Pal, had dated my mother prior to the war, and my father had known her. They got together. My father made a very unusual proposal. He said to her, "You were good enough for my brother, you're good enough for me." She accepted, and 2 weeks later they were married. My mother cooked all the foods for the celebration. According to the townspeople, they found my father to be remarkably resilient. After he returned to town, he appraised the situation, moved back into his house, and within 2 weeks he was able to get the farm up and running, buying livestock and planting the crops for the season. Is another photo of their wedding reception. My aunt was still in Hungary in 1947. She and her fiancé, Joseph Goldstein, left for Palestine in 1948. This is their wedding photo, and it's the first wedding that I attended. Okay, standing, if you look, hold on, let's make sure I push the right button. There I am. Probably no more than 2 or 3 weeks old. If you look at the other little baby, Her name is Agnes. Now I think they call her Sarah in Israel. I'll come back to her later because she'll be very instrumental as the story goes on. Standing on the right of my uncle to the right is my uncle, Yenu Helmetzi. He and his wife had 8 children. Their story of survival is the exception to the rule. The 10 of them survived because the train taking them to Auschwitz was bombed. They escaped their Nazi captors, and all survived. Okay, I lived in Summershy for the first 9+ years of my life. I was in the 3rd grade when we escaped Hungary. By the way, I just reconnected with somebody in my hometown who was in my 3rd grade class. I didn't remember it, but she did. Summershy was a small town with one general store, a barber shop, a liquor bar, a blacksmith, and a community center, and one church. Our home was lit with a kerosene lamp. We had one of the few radios in town. It was powered by a large battery. Some of my father's friends would come to us at night and listen to the radio broadcast as the men sat around peeling Jonathan apples fresh from our orchard. The river Somersh, which is a tributary of the Tisa and Danube, literally was in our backyard. We grew all our own vegetables in our garden. Dad had a barn with several cows. Each evening, Mom would milk the cows and stuff the geese with corn to fatten them up. I drank fresh milk every day. Mom used that milk for making homemade fresh hand-churned butter, sour cream, yogurt, and buttermilk. On Friday mornings, my parents would bake challah and the bread to be eaten during the week. My father made a good living by town standards from his apple orchard. Rather than sell the apples to a middleman, he would arrange for a truck to carry the apples to Budapest and sell it for retail at the farmer's market. I spent my summers playing soccer with my friend Oladar and my dog Bundash. Often my father would ask me to keep an eye on the cows as they grazed near the river in our yard. My parents worked hard and long. Farming was dangerous. They nearly died when they were both poisoned by nicotine pesticide that they were using on their apple trees. They were taken to the larger city near to us, Debrecen, where they were given antidotes and nursed back to health. I was about 5 years old at the time. It was a very frightening time for me. A family friend from Chenger stayed with me till my parents returned home. Okay, Summershy in 1956. No running water, no indoor plumbing, no paved roads, no telephones, no doctors or dentists, no electricity. About a year and a half after I was born, my mother gave birth to a baby girl, and she was premature. But without the lack of medical supervision or care, she died within about a week or so. She couldn't survive. The nearest synagogue, by the way, to our town was in a town called Porchalma, and that's about 4 miles away. And we would only go there on the high holidays, and we did it by walking, and it was quite an interesting trip because we had to cross the river, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Gift from Serena. In 1950, we received a gift package from my father's sister, Serena, who lived in the Bronx. The package contained coffee, chocolate, peanuts, and used clothing. Tucked into a jacket pocket was a $5 American bill. 2 days later, 2 men in leather coats come to our house, asked for my father. They were the Avos, which is a Hungarian secret police, and they took my father away. Unknown to us, the package was searched by the government before being delivered. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Okay, 5 years of prison and hard labor and 5 years probation and a monetary fine. Under the communist regime, possession of U.S. currency was a serious political crime. From 1950 to 1952, my father was in jail. My mother had to do the work of both of them for the 2 years that he was gone. She took me to a visit. She took me to visit him at a prison several times, but it was a long, arduous trip as we had to travel many miles by horse-drawn cart and steam railroads. Okay, this is the actual court decree sentencing my father to jail. Actually, this is not. Thanks to modern technology, about a week or two ago, I tried an experiment. On my phone, there's an app called Google Lens, okay? And I pointed the Google Lens at this document, and it immediately translated it from Hungarian to English. Okay, it turns out that this is actually his parole document. In 1952, there was a pardon of prisoners. So his 5-year sentence was commuted to 2 years, but he was still put on 5-year probation, and he still had that monetary fine. But this actually is the document that released him from jail. Okay, this is one of our identity papers, and it serves as my birth certificate. You know, I wasn't born in a hospital. I was born in my home. I don't have a birth certificate. So this is an identity paper that's attached to the house that we were living in. It has our address on there, and you know, I'm registered on there. Where am I? As you can see, Rosenfeld, Pal, and it has my birthday on there somewhere. Okay, anti-Semitism in Hungary was always present. Under pressure from the government, my parents considered changing our name to a Hungarian name. The name they chose was to be Rudas. The government was actively pushing Jews to change their names to Hungarian-sounding names. For example, our friend Gross Miklos became Gati Miklos, and our friend Miklos Gross became, no, I'm sorry, Miklos Schwartz became Miklos Sipos. Incidentally, his wife, who was one of the last of the original people that escaped at that time, just passed away in Canada a couple of weeks ago. I'm in touch with his daughter. My aunt, who was living in Israel, finally convinced my parents to emigrate and leave Hungary, and we applied for a visit to emigrate in October 1956. However, world events and history intervened. On October 4th, 1956, the visa to Israel had been granted, but historical events changed our plans. On October 23rd, 1956, Hungarian university students demonstrated against the government. Gunfire erupts, and many were killed in full-scale battles fought between the freedom fighters and the Russian military. At first, the Hungarians seemed to force the Russians out, but the Russians returned. I actually saw this, by the way, because we were in Budapest in December of 1956, and you see the tanks in the middle of the streets with the 6-story apartment buildings, some of them with holes blown out of them for tank fire. The Hungarian freedom fighters were using improvised weapons, specifically Molotov cocktails, and throwing them down onto the tanks, and the tanks were then blasting the apartments. Okay. As the revolution ends, the residents of HaShoah decide that the Jews were to blame. Okay? I get beat up in school, and I'm called a Büdös Zsidó, which translated to English means stinking Jew. A torchlight demonstration is held in front of our house that same night. My father makes up his mind, we must leave, and in 2 days, we are on our way. My father tries to sell off as much of our property as possible in the short time that we had. What he couldn't sell, we simply left behind. A Jewish friend in a nearby town had dealings with the smugglers, and my father asked him to find us someone who could get us out of Hungary to Austria. By the way, we were not alone in this. Over 100,000 Hungarians left Hungary during this 1-month period in 1956. With forged travel documents, we traveled to Budapest, a city that at this point was heavily damaged by the fighting. Russian tanks and soldiers with submachine guns were everywhere. We stayed at Adele Nani's, which basically translates to Aunt Adele's house. She was a close friend of the family who we visited regularly. She had been, when she was younger, she had been from my mom's hometown of Chengher. Okay, after a few days, we were contacted by the smugglers who instructed us to take the train to a border town. We followed the directions and arrived at a safe house near the Austrian border. On the night of December 21st, 1956, carrying all of our possessions, including the photos you view here today, we left with two men at nightfall and began walking toward the Austrian border. The journey was supposed to take 2 hours. The night was cold and clear. Thousands of Hungarians were escaping to Austria in the aftermath of the failed revolt. To stop the escapes, the border police lit the skies with a steady barrage of bright flares that illuminated the ground below. 4 hours into the journey, we realized something was wrong. I was cold and thirsty and also very tired. The only beverage for me to drink was a bottle of homemade slivovitz, which is plum brandy, that my father brought along. We were lost. After another hour of wandering aimlessly through farm fields and woods, we come to a paved roadway with a modern-looking building nearby. The smugglers decide that we must already be in Austria. To be sure, one of the two men goes to the building to ask for information. A woman in a bathrobe answers. She blows a whistle. We are trapped. This building is a border police outpost. The building lights up like a Christmas tree. The smuggler is detained. Searchlights are aimed at us, and we are ordered to surrender. We decide to run. The sky lights up like the 4th of July, between gunfire and flares. Tracer bullets are coming toward us. Lucky for us, their aim was bad. In all of the chaos, the second smuggler, the one who was captured, did manage to escape and eventually caught up with us. Now for my Twilight Zone and inexplicable experience. We are exhausted and still lost, sitting on our suitcase in an open, muddy field somewhere in Western Hungary. Imagine yourself on 441, you have those big farm fields. Imagine being just sitting in the middle of one of them in the mud, okay? As we're sitting there, it's probably 3 or 4 in the morning by now. As we sit there, a young man in a leather jacket approaches us out of the pitch black night. He asks us what we're doing. We tell him our story and tell him we're lost. He tells us that he's heading to Austria to visit his sister. We ask him, could he guide us? He says yes, but points out that it was getting close to dawn and it would be dangerous to make the crossing at this time. He asks us to follow him to a nearby town where he had friends that would allow us to wait for nightfall. We followed him to that town, and we stayed with him throughout the day. We rested up during the day, and by nightfall we left. The crossing into Austria on night number 2 was totally uneventful. Okay, after about an hour of walking, we came to a ditch in the ground. We went into the ditch, came out of the ditch, and the young man told us, "You are in Austria." Okay. We spent the first month in Vienna in a building that was a public school. We slept on mattresses on the floor in tight quarters. Look at the gym bags on the wall that say they Care USA. That organization was really helpful to the refugees. Vienna was a new world for me. I saw and ate my first banana and orange and saw my first black person. Okay, in the photo is another family whose members I'm going to point out to you. This is one of the families that I referenced in my discussion. That's Gati Miki, or Gross Miki, his wife, and his daughter Agnes, who was a childhood friend of mine, myself, and my parents. These are the people that we shared the room with. In my dialogue, I said 1 month. I recently got hold of a document that actually traces our time in Austria that I'll go over a little bit. We actually stayed in that room for 3 months. After leaving Vienna, we went to a small town called Kroneberg, a town on the Danube River. Ironically, the camp, that we were sitting in, or we were situated in, was only 12 years before a Nazi military base. Oh, hold on. I have the wrong slide up, but this is it. This document actually was issued when we entered Austria. I never knew the date, but this spells everything out for us. We arrived in Austria on December 22nd. We were transported to Kroneberg on March 18th, 1957, and we left for the United States on September 17th, 1957. A cousin of mine who's heavy into genealogy found this document and sent it over to me. Okay, after spending 9 months in Austrian displaced person camps, we were vetted by the United States State Department, and we were finally allowed to leave for New York. We arrived on September 18th, 1957. Our family met us at the St. George Hotel in Brooklyn. My great uncle, Sam Hershkowitz, was our sponsor. He found us an apartment in the Brighton Beach section of Brooklyn, found jobs for my parents. I started school, our new life in America as free Americans had begun. To quote my mother's favorite saying, which she would say in a thick Hungarian accent with great pride, God bless America. Okay. My parents became proud American citizens at their first opportunity in 1962, and I was given my citizenship papers as I reached age. My parents went back to Hungary two or three times in the remainder of their life, but their first time back was in 1967, 10 years after they had left. What you're looking at is a photo of a monument and a memorial to the Jews of Chengher that was erected in Israel. In the next slide, my aunt, Leah or Yuli, is pointing to the Samarshai inscription on the Holocaust Memorial, also in Israel. In 1988, Lenny and I visited Hungary. It was still a communist government. We did not go back again for many years. Many people asked why I did not return, because Budapest had become a very popular vacation destination. I really did not want to return because of all the unpleasant memories. This is a barn that my father built. It was used by our dairy cattle while we were there. In 1988, we found that a new resident was on the property, and she converted the barn into her residence. How she got the odor out is absolutely beyond me. Okay. The last time I was back was in 2019. I took this photo in 2018 because I was there 2018 as well. You could see the building is near collapse. My best friend from childhood, Boyne Gabor, in 1988. This is his family also in 1988, and his 3 daughters. These structures are still there. It's a corn drying hut and an outhouse. I remember when my father built the corn drying hut, I don't know who built the outhouse, but I did use it. Okay, Hungary today. Not much has changed. It's still anti-Semitic. The right wing, your big political party has significant representation in the government, and is overtly anti-Semitic, holding Nazi-style parades in Budapest. We found Budapest to be a beautiful city. However, Hungary is still deeply anti-Semitic. The coalition government, as I indicated, has a large group in there that are overtly anti-Semitic. Okay, when we were in Hungary, Lenny and I took a private tour. We went to the Dohány utca, or Dohány Street Synagogue, which up until the construction of the synagogue in Manhattan had been the world's largest synagogue. It's a beautiful building. And we had a private guide, and Lenny and I questioned him, privately. Is anti-Semitism still an issue? And he certainly assured us that it was, and he would not dare wear his kippah out in the street. As we continued with the tour, we went into the museum that's adjoining the synagogue, and we had a docent give us a tour, and I posed the same question to her, and she also concurred that it is still a major problem. Okay, Summershy in 2023. When I left Summershy in 1956, electricity had just been brought to town for the first time. The electric company installed one hanging light fixture in our one-room home with a wall switch. It would only work a few hours in the night when it was turned on by the company. Even the installation of the electrical service involved an act of anti-Semitism. Metal bars that were needed to attach the homes to bring the power lines in were needed. The townspeople decided that a good place to get the metal bars would be to remove the fence around the Jewish cemetery. So they stole the metal from the Jewish cemetery and repurposed it for the electrification of the town. So if you look at a photo in the cemetery that you'll see later, you're not going to see any fence. Okay. Most of the homes in Summershy today have been rebuilt and are made of cinder blocks. They really didn't have a choice. In 1970, there was a huge flood there. The River Summershy overflowed and caused major destruction. Many of the houses were built out of adobe, mud and straw bricks, and they did not have a chance against that kind of a flood. So even when we went back in 1988, which was 18 years after the flood, the people were living in fairly modern homes. My friend had a washing machine in there. He also had chickens running through the kitchen while we were having lunch, but that's another story. Okay, today most people have indoor plumbing and all have electricity. Some of the people even have cellular phones. Okay, back in Summershy. I got out of my rental car as we crossed the Summers River and had Lenny take a photo of me at the town sign near the entrance to the town that my parents were shown years before. This is I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from the town now. These are fairly recent. This is the Reformed Church. When I was a child, my father and I spent the night, okay, in the top of the belfry. Okay, we were on assignment. Everybody in town had to do it. We were on fire watch. Basically, at some point, you had to go up there and spend the night. And when my dad was assigned to do it, I asked to go along with him, and I did. Okay. New kindergarten in town. This is the actual well that nourished our family. Our house is gone, and the trees are new, but the well is still there. The gate to our property is still there. It's the original gate, and if you look in the back there, you can still see the well. And the corn drying hut, rather. Okay, this is the Jewish cemetery in town. The time that I happened to go there, somebody paid, I have no idea who did it, but if you look at the pile of grass, somebody paid to have it cleaned up. The last two times that we were there, it was totally overgrown. This is Main Street, Summershy. This photo was taken in front of the property where my house was. Now, you want to hear crazy coincidences? I found out on one of those ID papers that my house number was 31 Peto Fiuza, the number 31. The house my parents bought in Brooklyn was 31 Lancaster Avenue. The house I bought in New Jersey was 31 Sherrill Avenue. The house that Lenny and I moved into in New Jersey was 31 Terrence Drive. One of the apartments houses that we lived in was 3100. That's a stretch, but the digits were there. So if you ever look at my email and wonder why the number 31 appears at the end of my name, that's the reason why. Paul R. 31. Okay. Somershire is an isolated town. There is no bridge. If you want to get out of there, you have to cross the Somersh River. The machine that takes you across the river is called a hidash. Hidash is a derivation of the word hid, which in Hungarian means bridge. Okay, it's man-powered, and it's the only way to cross the Somersh River unless you want to drive 6 miles up to Chengher. So that's 20 minutes there and 20 minutes back. It's much faster to take it across this way. Crossing the Somersh River on the hidash. Okay. Lenny and Gabor on July 30th of 2016. Gabor passed away 9 months later. Why I went back to Hungary. This is it. Through the internet, I found out that my friend, well, let me even backtrack a little bit. When I left Hungary, there were only 2 things that I missed. My pet dog, Bundas, and my friend Aladar. That's Aladar. I never knew his real name. His real name was Gabor. He was always known by his nickname, Aladar. In any case, through the internet, I was able to connect with a cousin of him from town, and I asked, how's my friend Aladar doing? And he told me that his wife passed away 8, 9 years ago from cancer. His daughters were grown and moved to Budapest. He was by himself. He was very despondent and depressed. He was not doing well. I told Lenny, we got to go visit him. And that was my first visit back since 1988. This is the lake in my backyard as it appears today. When I lived there, the water level was basically down to nothing. Okay, after that flood of 1970, it filled up and stayed that way. This lake has become a sportsman's paradise, and people come from all over Hungary to fish in there, and you could lease space on a dock to go there. In fact, if you look in the background, you could see a little dock over there, and people will have signs posted offering, their place for people who want to spend time there and fish. A picture of Gabor and his cousins, Miklos and his wife, Maria. They were our next-door neighbors. He makes the best slivovitz. I got 2 bottles of it. Every time I go to him, I have to come back with a bottle of slivovitz. I keep one in New Jersey, and I have one here. My tennis friends approved it very highly when I brought it to the court a couple of years ago. The last time I saw Mimi Boynay was in the fall of 1956. Her family lived across the street from me. At that time, she was about 16 years old and a beautiful young teenage girl. Until I was told that she wanted to see me, I had not thought of her in almost 60 years, but I did remember her. Aladar, Miklos, Lenny, and I arrived at Mimi's home, and she was waiting for us with delicious homemade pastries. Any Hungarian's house you're going to go into, they're going to be waiting for you with delicious homemade pastries. Okay, she was very happy to see us, and she began to tell her story. In December of 1956, as my parents prepared to leave Somershire for the last time, they went to the Boynay families to say goodbye to them. The night that my parents visited Mimi's home, she was not there. She never had a chance to say goodbye to us. This laid heavily on her heart for all those years. She wanted to tell me the story and have closure. Mimi was moved to a home for the elderly last year, and she passed away in the winter of 2022. I stayed in contact with her, and I called her periodically, and I wanted to go back and visit her, but that's not going to be happening. When I referred to the person who identified my uncle, it was Mimi that I was talking about. As the day wore on, Aladar turned to me and said, "Paul, We are so sorry for the way you were treated and for the things that happened to your family. You know we were not like that. We were like brothers, and my family loved your family. I truly believed them, and I knew this all along. I would have never come back to Summershy had I not believed him in the first place. Other than my parents, my mother's sister Yuli, and my father's sister Serena, who moved to the States in the 20s, all other immediate family members were exterminated in the Holocaust. Most of you in this room have extended families. You lived your life having grandparents, and in some cases, even great-grandparents. They may be deceased, but you have your memories of them, and in most cases can visit the cemeteries where they are interred. My situation is different. I never had grandparents. They were exterminated in 1944. You are looking at the grave of the only member of my immediate family, other than my parents, who was buried in a cemetery whose grave I can visit. I'm going to take the microphone. Okay, I flew to Budapest on June 1st, 2019 to attend a commemorative gathering in Csengér, my mother's birthplace. On June 4th, Holocaust survivors from Israel and the second-generation family members from Israel, the United States, Canada, Sweden, and elsewhere gathered at the Jewish cemetery in Csengér on the 75th anniversary of the deportation of the Jews from the Csengér region. The Jews from the Máté Szalka ghetto were transported to Auschwitz and arrived on June 6th. By the end of the day, most of them, including most of my extended family, were gassed and dead. By the way, Máté Szalka had been in the news as of recent. Jamie Lee Curtis, her grandparents come from that town, and there's an old abandoned synagogue there, and she is financing the reconstruction and rehabilitation of it. My family from Israel arrives at the cemetery. This is the group of the people sitting there waiting for the ceremonies to begin. An elderly Israeli man who was born in Csengér and is a survivor of Auschwitz speaks to the gathering. Remember earlier I told you about this baby who was in the reception photo? There she is on the right with the glasses. That's Agnes. She was the one who had organized this gathering and reunion in Csengér. We were there precisely on the 75th anniversary. On that day, 75 years before, is when they were all taken to Auschwitz. Gita Mann and my new cousin George Munz. Gita Mann is a distant cousin of mine. She also is from my mother's hometown. She's about 93 or 94 years old. She had lived in Csengér, and up until this year, she was living in Jerusalem for a number of years, but she's now back in Marlborough, New Jersey. She's written a book about her Holocaust experiences, and she was doing a book signing tour actually in Hungary. The gentleman standing next to her is my newly found cousin. Lenny and I submitted DNA to myheritage.com, which is an Israeli company, kind of like 23andMe. George was identified as a second cousin. Our grandparents were brother and sister. Okay, I never knew that that part of the family existed, but George is heavily into genealogy, and he's filled me in on so much information, it's incredible. He's the one that got me that card that showed our route through Austria. A special exhibit was featured at the Csengér Museum. This is the list of the Jews killed from town. My grandfather, age 55, and grandmother, age 54, are listed on top. Hershkowitz Moses, and her name was Pepe Hershkowitz, but in Hungary they don't use the woman's name. They use the man's name and put N-E after it. It's like Mrs. Moses Hershkowitz. The unveiling of the memorial plaque on my mother's old Jewish day school on June 4th, 2019, That's the building that I referenced earlier that still stands, that had been the school. Rabbi Jungreis, the chief rabbi of Chenger, who, by the way, presides in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, because there are no Jews in Chenger, okay, and the mayor of Chenger unveiled a plaque. My cousin's 7-year-old granddaughter, Odaya, addresses the crowd with an impassioned speech. That's Agnes there again, sitting down. Odaya's speech. Please read along with me. My 7-year-old cousin spoke at the cemetery commemorating the victims of the Holocaust, my mother's hometown. These are her powerful words. My name is Odaya Speyer. I am in grade 1. I mostly love math and numbers. I am 7, and this is an important number. Also, I am a 4th generation to survivors, not a simple thing to be sure. I can also say that my grandfather has a number, but it's not in a book or notebook, but on his arm. When I asked for an explanation, I was told that I would be informed when I was older. Only when I'm older will they tell me about the Holocaust and heroism, on starvation and camps and cold nights, and how he survived due to big miracles. Now, there is no blood, and they also say then there are no more Jewish people. I am to say we are their blood and their people. Even though I am only 7, the smallest, and don't always understand, I do know that we are the victory and we are the regeneration. From dust has arisen a complete family. The visit to Chenger on June 4th, 2019 was a very emotional event for me. To be there precisely on the 75th anniversary of the murder of my family was very disturbing. The only consolation was that I, as well as the other survivors, were there. Our families have grown and thrived. Israel has a population of over 9 million people now. Thankfully, the final solution was not so final. As we said earlier tonight, never again. And tonight was dedicated to the memory of my parents, Dave and Sarah Rosenfeld, and the 6 million who perished. Thank you. My wife, Lenny, would like to say something for a second, and then we'll open up to questions if you have any questions.
This was put in front of me. I've never seen it before. This was written by Bobby Mannheim, called Poem for Paul. Oh, it wasn't written to her, for her, by her. Paul, your words were poignant and true as you shared with us the trials you've been through. From the Holocaust's horror to communism's grip, your journey has been one of courage and grit. You spoke of your family, of their strength and strife, and how they survived the darkest days of life. Their stories of resilience and hope were a testament to the human spirit's scope. Your own journey was not an easy one as you fled the terrors of communism, the fear and the hatred you left behind as you sought a place where you could unwind. But through it all, your spirit remained unbroken. Your faith in humanity never was token. You fought for what was right and true, and that, my friend, is what we all admire in you. This is a wonderful poem. Your speech touched us all in ways beyond measure, and we all felt humbled by your courage and treasure. Thank you for sharing your story with us and for reminding us of the power of trust. So here's to you, Paul, a true hero in every way. May your spirit continue to shine bright every day, and may your story inspire many more to overcome